Good evening and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm Steve Lance. Here's a look at what's coming up. Former President Trump wrapping up day 8 of his criminal trial in New York. What we're just learning and how Trump's responding to President Biden's long-awaited pledge to debate. Pro-Palestine protesters on the campus of George Washington University. NTD spoke with some of those activists to find out what they think about Israel and the war in Gaza. Former President Trump finishing the second week of his criminal trial in New York City. That's as President Biden makes a striking shift by now pledging to debate former President Trump. Joining us now live is NTD's White House correspondent, Iris Tao, who's outside of that courthouse in New York. Good evening, Iris. What is the latest there today?
Good evening to you, Steve. So a lot happened at this courthouse in New York today, but first let's talk about the big development. That is President Biden, after for months declining to commit to a debate with Trump, today says he's happy to do it. And here's Trump responding to Biden's pledge just now outside the courtroom. Watch.
We're willing to do it Monday night, Tuesday night, Wednesday night, Thursday night, or Friday night on national television. We're ready. Just tell me where. We'll do it in the White House. That would be very comfortable, actually.
And in that speech, Trump also criticized Biden's EV policies and what he called Bidenomics. So there you can see Trump going straight into campaign mode despite being stuck at this courthouse. Meanwhile, at this trial today, we saw two new witnesses, one being a longtime assistant to Trump in the past, the other being a former banker to former Trump lawyer Michael Cohen, who was allegedly involved in the alleged hush money payment. And meanwhile, the most crucial witness so far, though, is named David Pecker. He's the former publisher of the National Enquirer who spent days testifying at this trial. Trump's lawyer, when questioning him, tried to show that Trump had nothing to do with an alleged conspiracy to, quote, buy and then bury negative stories to avoid harm to his 2016 campaign. And Trump's lawyers were arguing that despite Pecker's payment to former Playboy model and Karen McDougal, it's standard operating practice for publishers to do that, as he was doing as well to many celebrities. And Trump's lawyers were arguing that it's not a crime related to Trump. And here's Trump addressing this trial just now outside the courtroom. Watch.
Mark Levin, can't believe this is happening in our country. There's no case here. There's no case whatsoever. It's a disgrace. We have a conflicted judge, and it shouldn't be happening. Not in this country. Thank you very much.
And today is the last day of trial in week 2 of the hush money trial. And the next court proceeding we're going to see will be next Tuesday when it resumes. Steve.
So, Iris, obviously a monumental week this week between the Supreme Court hearing the oral arguments yesterday and now, obviously, where you are there in front of the courthouse in New York. What can we expect next week?
Right, so a big thing that we're watching for is how the judge in this case will rule on the alleged gag order violations by Trump that prosecutors have been bringing up and actually doubling down on this week. That could come as early as next week, as a hearing on them is set for next Thursday. Meanwhile, on Wednesday, we're going to see Trump campaigning in both Wisconsin and Michigan. So back on the campaign trail on the one day each week that he's not being able actually stuck in this courthouse. And also, as we heard Trump speaking, he's challenging President Biden now to debate him on weekday nights next week after, of course, he's done with court. So let's see if that drama is actually going to take place anytime soon. Steve.
We'll certainly be keeping an eye on that. Iris Tao in New York City. Thank you. And as the former President Trump his team finishes cross-examining the former National Enquirer publisher today, then calling Trump's former personal secretary from years prior to taking office as its second witness. Let's now bring in Michael Berry, Executive Director of the Center for Litigation at the America First Policy Institute. Michael Berry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, Michael, without directly watching the testimony in the courtroom, we're really relying on reports that then get filtered through commentary. Based on what you've heard thus far concerning David Pecker's testimony, is this going well for Trump, or should he be worried?
Well, at the outset, I think we should all be worried because this is really a show trial to begin with, right? I mean, let's back up a second and think about what this case is really about. It's a bookkeeping, I wouldn't even call it an error. It's just a bookkeeping function that Alvin Bragg has decided to shoehorn into somehow becoming a felony conspiracy crime. Of course, it's being tried in Manhattan in front of a judge that is clearly biased against President Trump. I think it's going to be very difficult to find a jury in Manhattan that's not going to be biased against President Trump. So if you're starting from that playing field, then obviously we have things to worry about. But then once you start getting into the facts and the testimony, that's where things, ironically, actually start to improve for President Trump because the prosecution's case is so weak. And the witness testimony, again, like you said, I haven't been in the courtroom myself, but based on the reports that I'm hearing in commentary, they don't really have much of a case to begin with, but I don't think that's the point. I don't think they're actually looking for a conviction. I think what they're trying to do is tie President Trump up with so much litigation to keep him off the campaign trail because every day he spends in court and every dollar he spends on his legal defense is time and money that he cannot spend on the campaign trail, and that's what the ultimate objective is here.
Trump's defense started to cross-examine Pecker, and Trump's attorneys argued that Pecker's work suppressing negative stories to help former President Trump during the 2016 election was nothing new or out of the ordinary. Pecker calling his business model checkbook journalism, if you will. Where is the crime here, and what is the prosecution going for in this, do you think?
There is no crime, right? First of all, I mean, people sign non-disclosure agreements all the time. I've signed many non-disclosure agreements just in the normal course of employment, right, of just doing business in America. And so to have, and then this catch and kill or capture and kill notion, and people, again, they make it sound so sinister and like, oh, it's hush money. I think it was an op-ed I saw from a law professor from a pretty left-leaning law school who said, hush money may be unseemly, but it's perfectly legal, right? You can pay somebody and say, look, I'm going to, in exchange for the money that I'm paying you, I'm asking you to sign a non-disclosure so that you won't talk about whatever the issue is. That happens all the time.
I want to switch gears a little bit and get your thoughts on oral arguments on Trump's claim of immunity before the Supreme Court yesterday. Much of the arguments focused on delineating between official and private acts in the indictment. Trump's lawyer argued that official acts have to be expunged now from the indictment. Does it sound like from Chief Justice John Roberts' questions that the court could send the case back to the lower court to make those distinctions? And then what would happen to the rest of the case?
Yeah, I think that's a very real possibility. I think we could have 5, potentially 6 of the justices who would agree that, look, this seems to have been rammed through the prosecution by Jack Smith. It wasn't handled very carefully or very precisely, and this needs to go back down to the lower court, whether it's the Court of Appeals or even the trial court, to determine which of these acts that you're accusing President Trump with were official acts and which ones are you accusing him of doing in his personal capacity as a private citizen. That in and of itself would be a huge victory for President Trump because it would take months for that to be all untangled and figured out. And again, that would push us well into the late summer, possibly the early fall, and there just wouldn't be enough time left on the clock for them to prosecute President Trump before the November election. There's something called the Purcell Doctrine. It's a legal doctrine that basically says courts are not to hear cases or decide cases that could ultimately determine the outcome or influence the outcome of an election if those decisions are coming very, very close to the election itself.
Michael Berry, really appreciate you joining. Thank you.
Thanks for having me.
And turning now to the pro-Palestine demonstrations sweeping the country. With anti-Israel sentiment now on the rise, students and activists gathering at George Washington University to make their voices heard. NTD's Sam Wong has the story.
Pro-Palestine sentiment is running high on the campus of George Washington University. Behind the barricades, students have been camping out on school grounds since Thursday morning. Waving flags and chanting slogans, demonstrators appear to be undeterred by the heavy security presence in the surrounding areas. Activists and organizers are demanding that the university divest from companies tied to Israel because of the war in Gaza. Protesters are also asking authorities to drop all charges against pro-Palestinian students who were arrested. The university said the demonstrators had to clear out of the encampment by 7 p.m. Thursday. But up to this moment, the outrage carries on. Some fear the ongoing protests could trigger anti-Semitism on college campuses.
What they're doing is, they're just doing at the bidding of Hamas. You can't let Hamas continue what they're doing it. There won't be peace as long as Hamas is there.
The demonstrators were also joined by students and professors from other schools, including Georgetown, American, and George Mason universities, and the University of Maryland. Meanwhile, anti-Israel sentiment is picking up at schools across the country. It began with Columbia University in New York. Now at least 40 pro-Palestine camps have been established on different college campuses, from Boston to Atlanta to LA. And scuffles broke out this morning at the University of Southern California as police stepped in to disperse the crowd. Back in New York City, Columbia University set a 48-hour deadline on Wednesday for students to clear out. Now that the deadline has passed, the campus's main lawn remains occupied as anti-Israel agitators refuse to back down. There has been a total of more than 500 arrests across American college campuses so far. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Sam Wang, NTD News.
And as Columbia University officials have yet to enforce their own deadlines for protesters to remove their encampments, it has not brought in the police to clear them yet. I spoke with New York City Councilman Robert Holden about his reaction to the protests in New York City. New York City Councilman Robert Holden, thank you so much for joining.
My pleasure.
On the extreme end of your party, one might say, Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, she criticized the NYPD for their handling of student protests at Columbia, mentioning the violent reputations of certain units in the force involved. NYPD Chief John Chelles defended the professionalism of the officers. Is Ocasio-Cortez's criticism warranted, and does it potentially overlook the potential fear and unrest that these protests are causing some of these Jewish students?
Well, again, I don't really subscribe to much of what AOC says. She's anti-police, she's anti-law enforcement, she's anti-public safety. You name it, she's against it if it's right. So that's my party. And by the way, she's a Democrat, I'm a Democrat, but she's the far, far left. And again, it's really a socialist movement if you look at them. They want to tear down everything that is America. They want to tear down capitalism. They want to replace it with socialism, but it goes even further than that. There are many. It's based in a hatred, anti-Semitic, obviously, but it's based in a hatred of Israel, the government of Israel, and it's really. And if you ask most of these protesters, by the way, and we asked a few of them, what are you protesting about? And they don't even know. They really don't know. They don't know the issues. They don't know the history of Palestine or the Middle East. They're clueless.
Fox News highlighted the fears of Jewish students at Columbia University, reporting harassment and threats. I want to play some sound of that and get your reaction.
Jewish and Israeli people don't walk around on campus after the sun goes down. And I personally have been spit on, I've been yelled on, I've been told to go kill myself. My girlfriend has been followed home. A lot of the people don't go to the religious institutions and don't do Shabbat, with their friends and peers because they're scared.
Councilman Holden, how do these experiences reflect on the university's handling of the protests and the overall campus environment?
Well, it's disgraceful, and universities, and it's not only Columbia, there's many other universities across the United States that are mishandling this. This should be called out as hate. This is nothing but hate. It's reprehensible, but it's accepted, and it's accepted by the far left, and the left fringe of my party they're totally out of step with their constituents or the United States or Americans. They really should call this out. Everyone should call this out.
Fascinating perspective straight from New York City Councilman Robert Holden. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.
And coming up, what will come out of Secretary of State Antony Blinken's visit to China? Former China policy advisor to former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Miles Yu, will join us to discuss that and more when we return. And welcome back to the Capitol Report. I'm Steve Lance. Secretary of State Antony Blinken meeting with Chinese regime leader Xi Jinping in Beijing earlier today, wrapping up a three-day visit to China. NTD's Jack Bradley has more from the State Department.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken raised many issues on his visit to China, including concerns over the Chinese Communist Party supplying Russia with weapons that it uses to fight Ukraine. Blinken also met with his Chinese counterpart Wang Yi, who has accused the U.S. of overplaying its concerns that China's manufacturing overcapacity is flooding global markets. But Blinken reaffirmed these claims.
That allows those products then to be sold at low prices and sometimes below market prices in other countries, pushing businesses from those countries out of business and having potentially devastating effects on communities, on workers, on businesses. That's something that we have to, will, and are standing against.
The State Department says the two sides also talked about Taiwan and the South China Sea. This comes as the U.S. just this week approved over $8 billion to help Taiwan defend against the Chinese Communist Party's actions in the Indo-Pacific. Blinken said he discussed cracking down on fentanyl with Chinese officials. The majority of the fentanyl in the United States originates in China. A report this month by the House Select Committee on the CCP found that the Chinese regime subsidizes and provides grants to companies that produce and export fentanyl chemicals. While in Beijing, Blinken has said that the Chinese regime has been working to interfere and influence the U.S. 2024 election.
We have seen, generally speaking, evidence of attempts to influence and arguably interfere, and we want to make sure that that's cut off as quickly as possible.
This comes as President Biden signed a bill this week that forces TikTok to cut its ties with its Chinese owner, ByteDance, or be banned in U.S. app stores. Now, this comes amid concerns over data privacy, that the Chinese regime can access user data on anyone in America that uses TikTok. But Blinken said TikTok did not come up in the discussions with Chinese officials. Reporting from Washington, D.C., Jack Bradley, NTD News.
And to get reaction to Secretary Blinken's visit to China, let's bring in Miles Yu. He served in the State Department as China policy advisor to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and is now senior fellow and director of the China Center at the Hudson Institute. Miles Yu, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Of course, Miles, Secretary of State Antony Blinken in China today, where he gave a speech, many saying to stabilize relations with Beijing. He made it clear that the U.S. has no desire to decouple from China. Beneath the diplomatic speak, if you could sort of find any policy agenda from what you've heard and been following from Blinken this trip, and is the U.S. ultimately heading in the right direction when it comes to how we navigate the U.S.-China relationship?
By even responding to China's accusation of decoupling itself, it's an indication that we are falling into a trap set up by China. Because the most important part in deciding the nature and direction and even temperature of the bilateral relationship is not the United States, it's China. So China's behavior, China's expression of its intention is very clear. They were the ones that made this relationship unstable. And so we don't have to defend ourselves because we have laid out the card to China very clearly. And so China basically does not respond to appeal for honest and candid discussion. So what we're doing is always create a crisis, some kind of tensions before any possible negotiation, so that China would hope to gain some kind of upper hand in the upcoming investigation. That is the most important factor that really created this kind of escalation of tensions between the two countries.
Human rights, we know, is always a third rail in any meeting with Chinese leaders. We've been told that mentioning Falun Gong in particular is off limits by the CCP. Here's what Blinken had to say about human rights in his speech earlier today.
I also raised concerns about the erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy and democratic institutions, as well as transnational repression, ongoing human rights abuses in Xinjiang and Tibet, and a number of individual human rights cases.
As you could hear, no mention of Falun Gong in particular. You've been privy to these types of diplomatic discussions during your time at the Department of State. Can you kind of give us an idea of what it's like preparing for these meetings? And could the U.S. do a better job in challenging China's human rights atrocities head on without fear of, say, economic retribution by the CCP?
Well, you see, what had happened in the last 6-7 years since the Trump administration, I think endorsed by both Democrats and Republicans, is the fact that we want to engage China full spectrum, not just in some areas, but not other areas. So as has been practiced in the previous almost half a century since Richard Nixon visited China in the early 1970s. So what is the full spectrum engagement means is this. That is, we want to engage China not only on economic, technology, and cultural, educational area, but also on human rights, global security, intellectual property rights. Those things have to be into this kind of whole package. And I think, we cannot just engage China on what China is good at, but also by ignoring the weakness, vulnerability of that regime. The biggest weakness and vulnerability of the Chinese Communist regime is human rights. Human rights will basically decide the future relationship of the two nations and between the relationship between China and the rest of the world. Remember, the collapse of the Soviet Union started with the Helsinki package. That is, we forced the Soviet Union to even allow the discussion of human rights inside the Soviet Empire. China is trying its best to stop all the discussions about the human rights conditions in China because abuse and suppression of human rights is the innate nature of the communist regime. Once we focus on that, and I think the regime would really be afraid of. And this is also the biggest bargaining chip we have in any negotiation with China. Therefore, you mentioned about Falun Gong. Secretary Blinken refers to Hong Kong and other places where human rights was severely violated. And this is a precise approach. But I think we have been so timid, not to really put emphasis on this very important part of this bilateral relationship engagement.
I think you're absolutely right that human rights is China's Achilles heel, and we have to realize it and press it and leverage that. Miles Yu, really appreciate your insights. Thank you.
You're welcome.
And for round-the-clock original news coverage, visit us at ntd.com and download our NTD app. That is all we have for you this evening on the Capitol Report. Thank you so much for watching. From the nation's capital, I'm Steve Lance. Have a nice weekend. See you back here Monday.